I think I mentioned to you before that by 8th grade, a young person in this country will have seen 2,000 murders enacted in the media. And by the time they get to be 18, they've seen 200,000 acts of violence in the media. And what's that?
The convention's gone again.
It's okay. We know where that is.
Oh, okay.
You can turn the lights off again.
Yeah, the lights.
Yeah.
Great. If you, thank you. Okay, thanks. Something I think has affected our psyche since World War II, where now killing of non-combatants is not an issue anymore. Christian just war theory, one of the proponents, the pillars of just war theory ever since the Middle Ages, since Thomas Aquinas, was if you're going to have a just war, you don't kill non-combatants. Well, I mean, that's a laugh now. It's just no longer the case. And see if this is working now, see if we can advance it. Uncle Joe Stalin said, one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. And he was responsible for the deaths of more people than Adolf Hitler. And Mao Zedong went even better. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Mao was responsible for more deaths than Joseph Stalin.
Wow.
And
Wow.
and Pol Pot, he was a small-time guy. He was only responsible for 1 to 3 million deaths, but it was a country of 8 million, so he didn't have that many to kill. So that's within our lifetimes. And who says that that can't happen again? It's entirely possible that can happen again. Stalin and Mao both felt like they were victimized. So did Adolf Hitler. They felt like they're victimized. Everybody today feels victimized. And so, you know, you reach enough of a level of victimization, then you're entitled to kill people. That's kind of the way it works. That's the absurd logic of our time. And then Woody Allen says, the lion and the calf shall lie down together, but the calf won't get much sleep. And, so, you know, there's kind of twisted logic to that. But one of my favorite quotes that says the other side is from Winston Churchill. At Yalta, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill were dividing up post-war Europe. And at one point, Joseph Stalin sneered to both FDR and Churchill when the topic of the Vatican came up. And he says, how many troops does the Vatican have at its disposal? And Churchill replied, many legions, not all of them visible on parade. So there is a counterforce to the violence in today's world. And that is legions of angels and the power of God at work in our world. Now I want to introduce you to the most important person you have never heard of. Okay? That's him. His name is René Girard. Has anybody actually heard of him? Okay, 1 or 2 people have heard of him. Now, this really pains me to talk about him, because he is both a Frenchman and he taught at Stanford. I mean, that is... when he was admitted into the Académie Française, probably don't pronounce it correctly, which is the highest... Française, which is the highest honor that France pays to its intellectuals, he was called the Charles Darwin of the human sciences. That just as Charles Darwin took some very simple concepts like natural selection, and it's now used to explain a huge range of phenomena, so too René Girard has a few concepts that have been applied to anthropology, history, sociology, psychology, neuroscience, and a whole range of things. He has, I mean, I've only begun to be acquainted with him. But one of the amazing things about him is that he started out in literature. He studied French literature, taught French literature, and then English literature, Russian literature. And he discovered some patterns. That there's an immense amount in the fiction of our world of jealousy. People jealous of somebody else having it. Then that sets up rivalry and conflict and finally violence. And then he switched to anthropology and he saw the same kind of patterns. So he became, I mean, which is amazing, you know, to be an authority in literature and then to be an authority in anthropology. I mean, pretty phenomenal. And then what he did is he went to study the Bible. And he discovered that the Bible unlocks the mysteries of what he found in all these other disciplines. And what happened was he was baptized a Catholic. His mother was very devout, but his father was an anti-clerical French atheist, which there are many around. But when he made this discovery, he and his wife were married in the church. They had a civil ceremony before that. They were married in the church, and he had his 2 sons baptized. He's been going to church ever since. He probably should get a Nobel Prize, but he won't, because he's too explicitly Christian. And just to make a long story short, one of the things that he said is the Bible is unique in the literature of the world's religions because it alone is honest about violence and does not cover it over with mythology. I think a lot of people are troubled by the Bible because it's violent, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many times haven't you heard that one? Okay. And how many times haven't you been repulsed by the violence of the Bible? Okay? I've had people tell me they know they should read the Bible. I mean, these are church-going people. I know I should read the Bible, but it's just too violent. It just grates against my sensitivities. I can't go on into all of the details of what Girard says, but he says that in the Old Testament, for example, yes, there's a lot of violence, but it's not nearly glorified as much as it is in the mythologies of the ancient world.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hebrews are always somewhat squeamish about the violence that goes on in the Bible. They never can quite pull it off as smoothly as the Assyrians and the Babylonians and all of the others. And then he says, when you come to the Gospels, what we see is the antidote to violence. Because God takes the form of the suffering one, of the victim, not the victimizer. That is the key, he says, to all of human history. And he made a striking statement. Jesus died not because God willed it, but because humans wanted it. Doesn't mean that God didn't allow it. Of course he did. And in that sense, maybe God willed it. But turning around what a lot of people think, I think the impression that even a lot of Christians have is that God is this kind of angry deity that needs sacrifice to keep appeasing him, to keep him from getting angry. What Girard says is, no, it was human beings that wanted to kill this guy. Jesus didn't go into Jerusalem and say, hey, put me on the cross. He went in as someone who spoke the truth. When he went into Jerusalem, he went there and he cleansed the temple and he taught in the temple. He didn't do any political organizing, any military organizing. And it was because of the jealousy, of the rivalry between the authorities, the Jewish authorities, and the Romans, each trying to carve out their space of power, that finally is one of the factors that killed Jesus. I can't go into all of this because I don't understand all this thinking, but I think to me, it's like a revelation. Well, the Passion narratives in the Bible. You know what the Passion narrative is? That's the week between Palm Sunday and Good Friday. And we read that on Good Friday and other times during Holy Week. I'd like you to take a look for just a second in your Bible and go to the Gospel of Mark. It's the shortest Gospel. 16 chapters. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Where do you want us to go?
And I'd like you to go to chapter 11, the beginning of chapter 11.
We need to turn the lights on.
Lights, please.
Just the over, you don't put on the spots, just put the overheads on.
More.
Okay, so thank you.
Nothing.
So you got chapter 11?
Yep.
Now go to the end of the Gospel, to the end of chapter 16.
Okay.
And take a look at this for a second. Look at that much of the Gospel of Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 11 through 16, basically, is 1 week
Yeah.
in the life of Jesus. 1 week.
Mm-hmm.
And that's 30% of the Gospel of Mark. Well, think about this for just a second. Confucius lived to be 80 in his 80s. Buddha lived to be in his 80s. Muhammad lived to a very old age. Moses lived to 100. Jesus lived to 33?
33.
Yeah, 30-something. And the gospel itself, in total, talk about like 3 years of his life, and most of that is 1 week.
Yeah.
I mean, just think of the proportions of that for a second. I mean, it's amazing what they're trying to tell us. That the power is greater than the power of the atom. You know, you think of the atom, these little molecules unleashing these huge explosions. This 1 week is just incredible. The other Gospels aren't quite the same proportion. So Luke is maybe 20%, Matthew 20%, but that's still huge when you think about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that they spend so much time on just this 1 week, this passion narrative. So one of the things we have to realize when we start looking at the crucifixion is the gospel spent a lot of time with it and the events leading up to it. Another thing that we can't spend the time looking at is the greatest narrative unity among the gospels is in this 1 week. If you took a look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, up until the passion narrative, it's hard to synchronize the narrative. You know, like for example, Luke has 10 chapters of Jesus traveling from Galilee down to Judea, chapter 9 to chapter 19. It's not as long as it is in Mark. And John has Jesus going back and forth between Galilee and Judea. But when you get to Holy Week,
Everybody's on it.
there's unity. There's something really important going on, not only in terms of the volume of this week, but of the narrative unity. You know what else happens in this week? No miracles. No miracles. You think now would be the time you do a miracle, right? When you really needed it, doesn't do one. Kind of amazing, isn't it, when you stop and think about that? And also, like I said before, no political and military organizing on Jesus' part. You know, he's not going on to take Jerusalem. Or at least he does it in a kind of foolish way. You know, with a ragtag bunch of followers on Palm Sunday. You know, he cleanses the temple. And then what does he do the rest of the week? He teaches in the temple. He's a sitting duck. He's there without any armed guards, without any bodyguards. Especially after the Garden of Gethsemane, there's no initiative. Jesus doesn't take any initiative. You know, being led around. Kind of amazing. This guy who up until then set his face to Jerusalem, knew where he was going here, could understand the thoughts of people, took all this amazing leadership, and now, nothing. There are no heroes. You know, at the cross, okay, maybe John and Jesus' mother, Mary Magdalene, maybe. Nobody else. I mean, you know, for a founding narrative of a religion, no George Washingtons, no Benjamin Franklins, no Thomas Jeffersons, no Betsy Rosses. You know, they're all cowards, basically. And an early and drastic death. What a promising career he had. And then, within a couple days' time, he's gone. And it's terrible, being tortured to death. When you stop to think about it, this is really odd stuff. It's worthy of our consideration and wondering what's going on. I'd now like to show you what is, by almost consensus among art critics, the greatest painting of the Crucifixion. So, could we turn these lights off, please? Anybody know this painting?
These lights
There have been many theologians, Karl Barth among them, many Jewish philosophers who had this over their heads. It's a painting by a guy by the name of Matthias Neidhart. Interesting about him, Matthias Neidhart was somebody who had an opera written about him by Paul Hindemith, a German-American composer. And the opera is not performed anymore, but the suite oftentimes is. I think we heard that with Zubin Mehta, Matthias der Maler. It's about this painter, Matthias Neidhart, who painted this painting somewhere between 1510 and 1516. I weep when I look at that painting. That's Mary and John over here. John the Baptist And the words back in Latin are, he must increase and I must decrease, from John 3:30. And an interesting story about this. Neathart was given, and his name, through some jumbled history, became Matthias Grunewald. So maybe you know the name Matthias Grunewald. That wasn't his real name, but that's become his assumed name. He painted this for a monastery in Alsace. This is now in Colmar in Alsace. Have any of you been to Alsace? Yeah. And there's a number of other paintings at this museum. I'd love to go and see it someday. But it was painted for a place called Isenheim, in Isenheim Monastery. And this monastery, the monks there, operated hospitals. And they had been operating a hospital there for 300 years by the time he received this commission. And it was a hospital for people with leprosy and other physical sores on their bodies. So he painted Jesus bearing these sufferings on his body. I have never seen a crown of thorns looking that nasty in all my life. And with Jesus' head hanging to one side. His hand grasping up like that. And his feet turned in that way. His torso. Do you know what's wrong about that?
He has a bandage.
A loincloth.
Yeah.
You mean,
They don't put that on.
people were crucified naked. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged naked. That's the way the Nazis did it. They tried to debase you, humiliate you as much as possible. So that's the way the Romans did it. So, yeah, out of the sake of nicety, I did that. And his face. When you look at the crossbar, they're bent down by the weight of what this man is carrying. Crucifixion was the Romans' most severe penalty. If you were a Roman citizen and you needed to be killed, they'd behead you. That was the most humane way of doing that. Then after that, they would hang you, or they would burn you alive, or they would put you in a bag with scorpions and drown you. But the worst one was crucifixion. And it was to make a point. It was to deter people from doing what this person did. So what Jesus got was the worst form of torture that they could mete out. I talked before about the different criteria of reliability. Remember when we talked about that earlier? And talked about the criterion of embarrassment. To talk about a crucified Savior was absurd in the ancient world. It was absolutely embarrassing. I mean, this was a shameful and humiliating death. Everybody knew that. And even though it was common, I mean, Herod the Great crucified a couple thousand people. One of the Maccabee followers crucified 800 Pharisees. And I mean, even though it was all over the place, you could see crosses around on the major highways. The fact that you would say the Savior of the world was crucified was utter nonsense. And yet they proclaimed it. Just like N.T. Wright was saying, well, we don't think you're going to believe this about the resurrection, but it's true. So why? Why did this have to happen? Have you ever asked that question?
Mm-hmm.
When I asked my wife the question, she said, well, the answer is Jesus had to die for the sins of the world. Well, that's true. I believe that. But couldn't God do some other way? Than this? It's utterly inhumane.
Yeah. The Muslims say they don't believe this was
Yeah,
happening.
the
Because
Muslims
God
did
is
not.
God. He would have done it a different way.
God would have done it another way.
That's what they say.
Yeah, that's right. Jesus did, according to the Muslim faith, the Muslim scriptures, Jesus did not die on a cross.
No.
I mean, he escaped, or it was a swoon. I forget exactly how it goes. But God wouldn't be this way.
Oh, no.
And neither would the gods of the Greeks or Romans. God, it's the way God is operating. An utterly revolutionary way of looking at God. I mean, all the people I'm going to share with you now, they all said this is absolutely unique in the history of the world. I mean, Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad, Moses, not ended their life like this. So why? Here's our friend N.T. Tom Wright. He says, out of love, Jesus gave his life for fulfillment. Jesus was a devout Jew. And the Hebrew Bible says that salvation is from the Jews. So it was not only to fulfill the prophecies of Israel, Isaiah 53 and others, but to fulfill the mission of Israel. He was being a Jew in doing this, to show that the light of God's love to the world. So Jesus was not being un-Jewish at all in this way. For forgiveness, he took the fate and judgment of the world on himself. You know, what happened, what was going on in the time of Jesus was, as Wright said earlier, there's a lot of revolutionary movements. We're going to throw the Romans out. And you know what happened? They didn't throw the Romans out. In fact, the Romans started crucifying and killing people, destroying the temple. And how long did it take for the Jews to get a homeland after that? 2,000 years. And it's like Jesus saying, no, don't do it, stop! I'll take it on myself. For forgiveness, take that all on himself. Faith, that God would vindicate his death. The cross is a great act of faith, if you will. And finally, freedom. What keeps us from being good so much of the time? We're afraid of the consequences. If I'm too honest, I might lose my job. If I do that, I could really be seriously hurt. Or, you know, ostracized. Right? I mean, one of the reasons why, do you know the single most frequent commandment in the Bible? Don't be afraid.
Fear not. Yeah.
Fear not. That, you know, it's not be good or else. You know, that's the people. No, the most common commandment, imperative in the Bible, is fear not. In fact, probably some of you know that it's 365 times in the Bible. So we get one for every day of the year. And it's so oftentimes it's fear that keeps us from doing God's will. What is right? I'm afraid. Okay? I don't know about you, but that's kept me from being good a lot of times in my life. So that's what Tom Wright says. And Tim Keller. Christianity is the only religious faith that says that God himself suffered. It is the ultimate proof of his love for us. God was willing to share the worst kind of suffering imaginable. You think you're suffering? Try hanging on a cross. Try, I mean, one physician who analyzed what crucifixion like, it's like 1,000 dentist drills, drilling into every part of your body. And it's the ultimate proof, not the only proof. If you're talking about creation, that's a proof of God's love for us. Our bodies, our minds are proofs of God's love. There's all kinds of proof, but this is the ultimate one. To make sure that nothing can happen to us without knowing that God can love us, even in that terrible circumstance. Martin Luther said the cross of Christ shows us two things at the same time. Simultaneously. It shows us our sin, and it shows us our salvation. Our sin because, if, as I said before, if I have a choice between being tortured to death and getting out free, I'm going to get out free. We can't blame Peter and all those people. They only had two options. Show that you're being thrown in with Jesus, and then you're going to be crucified, tortured to death, or you're going to get off, and you're going to comply. So that's one way, is it shows me my sin and my cowardice. And, you know, another way is, I'm not willing to love to that extent. I'm not. I mean, I'll love within my comfort zone, and maybe get out of my comfort zone a little bit. But, you know, I've got limits to that. But at the same time, it shows us our salvation. Because Jesus was willing to do that in place of me, and for the human race. The cross, Luther was really big on this. The cross can be terrifying. It's terrifying. It's terrifying to see what human beings can do to one another. It's terrifying to see my lack of heroism and courage. You mean, to be a Christian, I've got to be crucified? That scares the bejeebers out of me. So it can be the worst form of law, if you will. At the same time, it can be the greatest form of salvation. That God would love me to that extent. And the Apostle Paul, who was, or St. Paul, if we can call him that, who was Jesus' first interpreter, agrees with all of these people. He says that I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself, we would say, totally for me. he also goes on to say, while we are still sinners, Christ died for us. Not for good people, but for sinners. And then he draws what I think is what he's intending to say is the point. What's the point for living? For you and me. And Philippians 2, he says this. Think like Jesus. It says, have this mind be in you, which is in Christ Jesus. Think like Jesus. And who is Jesus? He didn't hang on to his divinity, but he humbled himself, becoming a human being and a servant, even to the point of dying on a cross. What does it look like to be a follower of Jesus? This is it. Here it is, at least according to the Apostle Paul. I mean, you could, to humble yourself, to become a servant. That's what it means to be a Christian. We are servants. We have a servant God who served even to the point of dying on a cross. And I find that pretty powerful stuff. And so what I'd like to ask you to do, I think I've got. Oh yeah, I'd like to share with you. The poets will do a much better job of this than me. And Jack Shea is a former Roman Catholic priest. And this isn't about the crucifixion, but I think somebody was bringing this up about before, oh yeah, it was you, Norma, about power going out of Jesus when the woman touched him. Right. So this is a prayer to the pain of Jesus. Father, when crutches were thrown away, did your son limp after the running cripples? Did Jesus' eyes dim when Bartimaeus saw? Did life ebb in him when it flowed in Lazarus? When lepers leaped in new flesh, did scales appear on the back of his hand? The Gospels say Jesus felt power go out from him, but neglect to say whether at that moment pain came in. Did the Son of God take on ungrown legs and dead eyes in the terrifying knowledge that pain does not go away, only moves on? My own personal profession of faith is that I believe the greatest sign of Jesus' divinity is he has the greatest heart of anybody who ever lived. He had the greatest heart. He was able to take in more pain, more heartache than I'm capable of, or anybody else in the history of the world, to take that into his heart. Don't see any, just look at the record of the human race. Greatest heart that ever lived. And another poet, a poem that probably you know, Those Winter Sundays. How many of you know that poem? Hard to read this. Robert Hayden is an African American. He's no longer living. But this is, I don't know any other poems we've read, but this is one of them. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, he made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? My own personal belief is the way people become Christians is they get loved into it. We need to have understandings. We need all of those ideas and stuff. But without love. Remember we looked at that passage from John 13? Jesus said, how are people going to know that you're my disciples? Remember? If you love one another. Not if you're the richest folks on the block. Not if you're the coolest folks on the block. Not if you're the smartest folks on the block, but if you love one another. And that's what I think this act is about. This enormous, enormous act of love that stands at the very center of our faith. So I'd like you to break it into your groups if you would. And we've got some questions to talk about. And you can tack on one about the crucifixion if you want, but we didn't talk about, has your faith in Jesus had any influence on you as a sexual person? If so, how? Are we doing enough as churches to support people with issues of personal intimacy and sexuality? Should this be done publicly or privately? Do you think of Jesus as a powerful person? I remember one time when I was in a difficult time in my ministry, and I went to a workshop with one of the leading consultants on pastoral ministry in this country. And I was pretty close to being burned out. And I had a private conversation with this man, and he said, you know, they didn't kill Jesus because he was burned out. Because he was strong. Strong, he was a powerful person. And I think it gets back to what Dallas Willard was saying earlier. We think of Jesus as being nice. We think of him as being powerful. Does he empower you in any ways? If so, in what ways? And then if you want to talk about the crucifixion, anything we talk about, please feel free to do that. So, would you mind
Can I
getting...
just ask what the second sentence of question 2, should this be done in publicly or privately? What does that mean?
If we're going to support people with issues of personal intimacy and sexuality, does it mean should we be preaching sermons on it,
Oh,
doing it more publicly, or should we work, you know, with individuals or something of that sort?
Okay.
Got it?
Yep.
Would you mind getting in your groups for 15 minutes or so?